right, guys, by now I'm sure you've heard the news of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez passing away. He lost his 2-year battle with cancer on Tuesday, March 5th at the young age of 58. Although he gave a voice to the Venezuelan people in a way unlike any other Venezuelan leader, during his 14-year leadership, Chavez was a controversial and polarizing figure on the world stage, who was both hailed and smeared. Now, if you're looking at the rhetoric from the U.S. establishment, you're only getting the side of the story that paints Chavez as a ruthless dictator, a tyrannical socialist, and a madman dead set on destroying America. See for yourself.
Well, it's being called the tour of tyrants. Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez making a joint appearance yesterday. You're seeing video of that, joking about Iran's nuclear program and U.S. anger.
The problem? It's coming at the hands of a man the U.S. describes as nothing short of a dictator, President Hugo Chavez.
Strong words from media organizations who had already made up their minds about what type of leader Chavez was. So how is the same establishment press running with the news of his death? Let's find out.
We move on now to the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who lost his 2-year battle with cancer on Tuesday. He was a polarizing and outspoken figure.
He referred to the U.S. as the evil empire and famously branded U.S. President George W. Bush as the devil during an address at the United Nations, and he warned his countrymen frequently of an impending U.S. invasion of Venezuela.
Adding to the tension was Chavez's long list of dubious friends, a who's who of American enemies, from Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and Iraq's Saddam Hussein.
The price of his socialist agenda? Hugo Chavez himself. Term limits were abolished. Even his critics admit he could have gone on winning elections indefinitely. His biggest failure may be his unilateral success, a legacy of one. Before his death, critics said Chavez was leaving Venezuela in the control of narco-traffickers.
And this morning, U.S. officials are wondering how his passing will impact relations with the oil giant.
Yes, of course, the big question, what's going to happen to the oil? Can you make it any more obvious? Look, I'm not going to sit here and glorify Venezuela or Hugo Chavez or socialism, for that matter. In fact, there are many legitimate criticisms to be had. Take, for example, the heightened rates of violence and censorship and prosecution of political dissidents. But you'll hear the less appealing aspects of Chavez ad nauseum from the corporate press. So my job is to tell you what they won't. And I'm going to lift the veil on the most egregious myths said about the Venezuelan president. So let's get back to the subject of oil. After all, Venezuela has the largest reserves of crude oil in the Western Hemisphere. And the bold move by Chavez to nationalize the country's petroleum resources has been one of the biggest points of contention. The seizure of foreign and corporate-controlled lands in the country, along with the redistribution of wealth amongst the populace, are notions that do not sit well with many. Unlike other developing nations that allow multinational corporations to sell off the country's natural resources, Chavez began to initiate incremental steps giving the state full control over its oil reserves. With these funds, the government was able to instate various programs of social development aimed at narrowing the country's wealth disparity and developing Venezuela into a principal player in the international community. Despite what you've heard about Hugo Chavez, it is undeniable that under his leadership, the poorest in the country were empowered. In 2009, the Center for Economic and Policy Research published a report on Venezuela's economic expansion. It highlighted that under Chavez, the country's GDP nearly doubled in only 5 years. Extreme poverty was down by 72%. Child mortality down by 1/3. There was unprecedented access to universal health care, and college enrollment was on the rise. Still, the myth we hear is one of a socialist comandante who manipulated the poor with handouts to gain their loyalty and support. But in reality, he helped the poor enormously. Just a fact that doesn't bode well with people supporting corporate domination over the region. Another media talking point is that Chavez was a ruthless dictator who redrafted the Constitution to dissolve term limits to ensure his perpetual tyrannical reign. Dictator? Not so much. Chavez won the seat of president 4 separate times, often by an overwhelming majority. The last election alone drew over 80% voter turnout. It was a process that former U.S. President Jimmy Carter characterized as being, quote, the best in the world. The referendum in question that dissolved term limits was voted and passed by over 70% of the people in the country. Sorry, it was voted on, passed by over 50%. So, when it comes to democratic participation, Venezuela puts the U.S. to shame. You won't find that kind of enthusiastic voter turnout anywhere in this country. Chavez also has been painted as a conspiracy theorist and loon for his questioning of the Bush administration's role in 9/11 and for accusing the U.S. of assassination and coup attempts to unseat him. But is it really so ludicrous to imagine that scenario, given the CIA's sordid history of assassinations and coups across Latin America against leaders that didn't quite fall in line with American interests? In fact, there's mounting evidence linking the Bush administration to a 2002 coup that briefly did oust Chavez. And officials at the Organization of American States have said that the U.S. was not only aware of the coup, but that they in fact sanctioned the coup. By dismissing Chavez as a dictator, like the media machine tends to do, we're ignoring all of these valid points. That same media machine ignores the impending tyranny in this country, the soft fascism leading to the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens in 12 years of endless war. When you look at who Chavez was lumped in with, the likes of Fidel Castro, Muammar Gaddafi, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and Saddam Hussein, they share a commonality. They all opposed the U.S. corporate imperialist takeover of the planet. Going forward, keep this in mind. When a leader is vilified and demonized, it usually signifies their threat to the status quo. So, regardless of what you've heard, or what your personal thoughts are about Hugo Chavez, he simply cannot be dismissed as a tyrant, because his voice of opposition and others like him serve a necessary divide to prevent global corporate enslavement and tyranny.